At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, the humid air of Guadalcanal hung heavy and suffocating over the chaotic debris of what was once a pristine coconut grove. Second Lieutenant John George crouched low in the smoldering ruins, the sweat stinging his eyes as he pressed his cheek against the cool, polished walnut stock of a rifle that had absolutely no business being on the battlefield. He was watching the gnarled, twisting branches of a massive banyan tree through a telescopic sight that his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. To the uninitiated observer, or perhaps a visiting general from the Pentagon, George looked less like an officer of the United States Army and more like a wealthy, eccentric tourist who had taken a disastrously wrong turn on a weekend hunting expedition. Cradled in his hands was not the standard issue M1 Garand, the semi-automatic marvel that General George S. Patton had famously declared to be the greatest battle implement ever devised. Nor was it the heavy, reliable Browning automatic rifle that provided the squad suppressing fire, or even the mass-produced Springfield 1903 carried by the Corps. Instead, the wood of his stock was fine, checkered walnut. The bolt action was hand-tuned to a glass-like smoothness, and the optic mounted on top was a delicate, high-magnification, Unertal telescopic sight designed for punching paper targets at peaceful, manicured shooting ranges back in the United States. It was a Winchester Model 70, a civilian sporting rifle, a weapon purchased through a Sears Roebuck mail order catalog and shipped across the Pacific Ocean to the green hell of the Solomon Islands. For weeks, the men of the Americal Division had scoffed at the lieutenant and his, quote, toy, cracking jokes in the chow line that he intended to hunt deer while they fought a world war against the Empire of Japan. They called it a rich man's gadget, a liability that would break the moment it touched the mud. But the laughter in the foxholes had died abruptly that morning, replaced by a tense, respectful, and almost prayer-like silence. Because out there, amidst the rotting vegetation, the razor grass, and the stifling heat of the Point Cruz sector, an invisible enemy was killing them one by one, dissecting their formation with surgical cruelty. And Lieutenant John George was the only man in the entire battalion who could see the ghosts in the trees. To fully grasp why a civilian hunting rifle became the pivot point of a vicious, high-stakes, 4-day skirmish, we must first immerse ourselves in the desperate, grinding stalemate that defined the closing months of the Guadalcanal campaign. By January 1943, the Starvation Island, as the Japanese defenders bitterly called it, had consumed thousands of lives and shattered the illusions of quick victory for both sides. While the headlines back home in America celebrated the initial heroism of the Marine landings months prior, the reality on the ground had descended into a grinding, muddy war of attrition that resembled the trench warfare of the First World War, but transplanted into a malaria-infested jungle. The United States Army, specifically the Americal Division and elements of the 25th Infantry Division, had relieved the exhausted 1st Marine Division. Their task was inglorious but vital, rooting out the remaining fanatical Japanese forces entrenched near Mount Austin and the formidable natural barrier of the Guadalcanal River. This was not the open, maneuver warfare of the European theater, where tanks could dash across plains. This was a claustrophobic nightmare of green shadows, sudden death, and rot. The Japanese defenders, though starving, ravaged by dysentery, and cut off from supply lines, remained masters of camouflage and static defense. They had turned the terrain itself into a weapon, constructing an elaborate, nearly invisible network of spider holes, camouflage dugouts connected by underground tunnels, and more lethally, they had perfected the dark art of tree sniping. The situation at Point Cruz had become a literal slaughterhouse for the advancing American infantry. A platoon would move forward, pushing through the razor grass and dense undergrowth, sweating under 60 pounds of gear, only to be pinned down by accurate, single shots that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The Japanese snipers were not merely soldiers taking pot shots. They were an integrated part of a defensive doctrine designed to bleed the Americans for every inch of ground. Often tied securely into the high canopy of palm and banyan trees to prevent their bodies from falling and revealing their positions after death, these snipers were wreaking havoc on American morale. They used the Type 99 Arisaka rifle, a robust weapon chambered in the powerful 7.7 millimeter cartridge. Crucially, the Arisaka used a specially formulated smokeless powder and possessed a long barrel that minimized muzzle flash. In the dim filtered light of the jungle, this made the shooter nearly impossible to locate by sound or visual signature. The standard American response to this invisible threat was sheer volume of fire. An infantry squad, panicked and frustrated, would spray the tree line with hundreds of rounds from their M1 Garands and BARs, hoping to hit something, anything, by sheer luck or saturation. But luck was in critically short supply at Point Cruz. The M1 Garand, for all its semi-automatic brilliance and reliability, was equipped with standard iron sights. In the low-light conditions of the deep jungle, trying to spot a Japanese helmet that had been specifically painted with mud and foliage to match the mossy bark of a tree 200 yards away, and then engaging it through iron sights was an exercise in futility. It was like trying to shoot a shadow in a dark room. The Americans were burning ammunition at an unsustainable rate. Their advance had stalled completely, and morale was plummeting. Men were dying simply because they could not see what was killing them. This was the precarious context in which Lieutenant John George found himself. However, George was not a typical infantry officer. Before the war, he had been a dedicated, perhaps even obsessive, competitive shooter and a student of ballistics. He was a man who believed that the precision of the individual marksman was being dangerously undervalued in an era obsessed with machine guns and artillery. He understood the mathematics of flight, the effect of humidity on trajectory, and the psychology of the hunter. He had brought his personal Winchester Model 70, chambered in the powerful and flat-shooting .3006 Springfield cartridge, not as a souvenir or an affectation, but as a calculated tool of war. He knew, with the certainty of an expert, that the jungle required a different kind of optical solution. The standard military scopes of the time, such as those found on the M1903A4 sniper variants, were often rudimentary, lacking the light-gathering capabilities and the fine crosshairs needed to distinguish a human form from a twisting vine in the gloom of the rainforest. George's rifle, by contrast, was fitted with a high-quality unital target scope. It was a piece of precision glass, fragile compared to the rugged military gear, susceptible to fogging if not cared for, and liable to break if dropped on the coral rock. But it offered a clarity of vision that no other soldier in his sector possessed. It turned the blurry green wall of the jungle into a high-definition landscape where every leaf and shadow could be analyzed. As the sun climbed higher on that humid January morning, the heat radiating off the jungle floor began to create shimmering mirages that distorted the air, adding another layer of difficulty to the shot. The platoon was pinned down again, the dirt kicking up around them as Arisaka rounds snapped through the air. A single Japanese sniper, positioned masterfully in the dense canopy overlooking a ravine, had effectively halted the advance of an entire company. The efficiency of the enemy was terrifying. Every time a GI raised his head to scout, a 7.7 millimeter round would crack past, forcing everyone back into the mud. The frustration among the American ranks was palpable, a mixture of rage and helplessness. The company captain, desperate to break the deadlock without calling in a mortar barrage that might endanger his own forward elements or miss the tree-bound enemy entirely, turned to George. George moved into position, sliding the barrel of his Winchester through a small gap in the rotting logs of a fallen coconut tree. He didn't just look. He scanned with the methodical discipline of a scientist. This is where the training of the competitive shooter transformed into the instinct of a combat sniper. He wasn't looking for a man. He was looking for the anomaly. He was searching for a branch that didn't sway with the rhythm of the wind, a patch of bark that was too smooth, a shadow that fell in the wrong direction. Through the crystal clear glass of the unital scope, the chaotic wall of green resolved into distinct layers of depth. He adjusted the objective lens, dialing out the parallax error, his hands moving with practiced memory. And then he saw it. Not a whole soldier, but the glint of a rifle barrel, followed by the subtle rise and fall of a chest tied securely against a thick branch, draped in netting. The distance was roughly 250 yards, a chip shot for a match shooter on a range, but a mile for a terrified infantryman with iron sights under fire. George settled his breathing, forcing his heart rate to slow, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He applied the slingshot technique, wrapping his leather shooting sling tight around his upper arm to stabilize the rifle, a technique almost forgotten by the modern army that was becoming obsessed with semi-automatic firepower. He exhaled, pausing at the natural respiratory pause at the bottom of the breath, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, a familiar and sharp recoil. The crack of the .06 cut through the humid air, distinct and sharper than the duller thud of the Garands. High in the tree, the anomaly shattered. The Japanese sniper slumped forward violently, the tension of the ropes the only thing keeping him from plummeting to the earth. The firing from the tree stopped instantly. A cheer, ragged and relieved, went up from the American line. In that single second, the dynamic of the battlefield shifted. The men realized that the ghosts were mortal, and they had a guardian angel with a hunting rifle. Before we continue deeper into this 4-day duel, I want to ask you a question that military theorists and commanders have debated for over a century. In the age of drones, missiles, and advanced technology, do you believe the raw, individual skill of a single marksman still holds the power to change the course of a battle? Or is technology now the only factor that matters? I'd love to hear your perspective, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below. That first kill was merely the catalyst. For the next 48 hours, Lieutenant George went on the offensive. He didn't wait for the enemy to pin them down. He began to hunt the hunters. Moving with a small security detail, he prowled the edges of the American lines at Point Cruz, actively seeking targets. The Japanese, unaware that the Americans now possessed a weapon capable of matching their concealment with high-powered magnification, continued their standard tactics. They relied on the belief that they were invisible. It was a fatal error. George systematically dismantled the Japanese sniper screen. On the second day, he spotted a cluster of enemy observers directing mortar fire from a ridge 300 yards away. Standard doctrine would have called for an artillery strike, a clumsy solution that would take minutes to coordinate and might miss entirely in the difficult terrain. George took 3 shots in 10 seconds. Bolt back, round chambered, fire. Bolt back, round chambered, fire. 3 observers fell. The mortar fire ceased immediately, saving countless American lives in the valley below. However, war is the ultimate learning environment, and the Japanese were veteran fighters who adapted quickly. By the 3rd day, they realized that a specific high-value threat was operating in the American sector. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The Japanese snipers began to employ bait tactics specifically designed to lure George out. They would fire a shot to expose a position, but the source of the fire would be a decoy, a helmet on a stick, or a corpse rigged to move with a rope, while a second, master sniper waited in silence, watching for the muzzle flash of the American counter sniper. This escalated into a deadly game of cat and mouse on days 3 and 4. The environment itself seemed to turn against George. The humidity threatened to fog his scope, requiring constant, delicate maintenance with lens cloth. The mental strain of staring through a lens for hours, waiting for a single pixel of movement, was exhausting, causing eye strain and headaches. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, George faced his closest brush with death. He had set up a position near a shallow ravine, tracking a sniper who had wounded 2 runners earlier that morning. He spotted the enemy, a master of camouflage, buried in the root system of a banyan tree. As George aligned his crosshairs, a sudden instinct, a sixth sense honed by days of constant danger, made him roll violently to the right. A split second later, the ground where his chest had been exploded. A second Japanese sniper, expertly concealed to cover his partner, had been watching George the entire time. George tumbled into a muddy shell crater, fetid water seeping into his boots, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was pinned. The second sniper had him zeroed. Every time he tried to inch the Winchester up the muddy bank, a bullet would snap inches from his head, kicking up dirt and debris. He was trapped in a hole filled with stagnant water, the stench of cordite and rotting vegetation filling his nose, ants crawling over his hands. This is the reality of sniping that movies rarely show. It isn't just about the shot. It's about the terrifying vulnerability of being alone, pinned by an enemy you cannot see. For 2 agonizing hours, George lay motionless, letting the insects bite him, letting the tropical sun bake him, waiting for the Japanese shooter to believe he was dead or had retreated. It was a test of supreme patience and mental fortitude. Finally, the enemy made a mistake. Believing the threat neutralized, the Japanese sniper shifted his position slightly to target a passing squad of GIs. The movement of a fern leaf was all George needed. He rose from the mud like a swamp creature, brought the Model 70 to bear with fluid speed, and fired a snapshot. The round found its mark. The threat was ended. By the end of the 4th day, the tally was staggering. Lieutenant John George had confirmed 11 kills against elite Japanese snipers and observers. But the number 11 doesn't capture the true impact of his actions. He had effectively blinded the Japanese defense in the Point Cruz sector. Without their eyes in the trees, the Japanese mortar teams couldn't target the American advance. Without the fear of the invisible death from above, the American infantry moved with renewed aggression and confidence. The psychological paralysis that had gripped the battalion was broken. An entire Japanese defensive strategy, built around the impunity of their snipers, had been dismantled by one man with a civilian rifle. He had proven that precision fire could suppress the enemy far more effectively than random volume. Following the securing of Guadalcanal in February 1943, the legend of John George and his Winchester spread throughout the Pacific Command. The Army, rigid as it was, could not ignore the results. George was pulled from the line, not to be reprimanded for using non-standard gear, but to teach. He was tasked with establishing a sniper school, training a new generation of marksmen to look through the scope, not just as shooters, but as observers and hunters. His doctrine emphasized fieldcraft, patience, and the ability to read the jungle, skills that would prove vital in the upcoming campaigns. George's war didn't end in the Solomons. He would take his skills and his rifle to the jungles of Burma, joining the legendary Merrill's Marauders, a special operations unit that operated deep behind enemy lines. There, the principles he proved at Guadalcanal, light logistics, precision fire, and individual initiative, became the difference between life and death in one of the harshest environments on Earth. After the war, John George did something equally important. He wrote it all down. His book, Shots Fired in Anger, published in 1947, remains one of the most significant works on combat marksmanship ever written. It is not just a war story. It is a technical manual and a philosophical treatise on the role of the rifleman. It stripped away the myth of the spray and pray tactic and argued passionately for the return of the sharpshooter. Today, that Winchester Model 70, the rifle that was mocked as a toy and then revered as a savior, sits in the National Firearms Museum. It is silent now, resting behind glass, a simple collection of wood and steel. But if you look closely at the stock, you can almost see the scratches from the sharp coral rock of Guadalcanal. and the wear from the sweaty hands of a lieutenant who refused to accept the limitations of his equipment. The story of Lieutenant John George is a powerful reminder that in the massive industrial grinder of modern warfare, the human element remains the decisive factor. It wasn't the technology of the scope alone that won the fight. It was the man who knew how to use it. It was the audacity to bring a hunting rifle to a machine gun fight and the skill to win. It challenges us to think about innovation. True innovation isn't always about the newest, most complex gadget. Sometimes it's about applying a precise tool to a chaotic problem. If you found this story of courage, innovation, and precision inspiring, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps us bring more hidden history to light for viewers like you. John George's legacy is not just in the enemies he defeated, but in the lives he saved by clearing the path for his brothers in arms. He proved that a single well-aimed shot, delivered with calm amidst the storm, can thunder louder than a barrage of artillery. He showed us that the warrior, not the weapon, makes the lethality. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the tactics and heroes that changed the course of military history. We have a fascinating episode coming up on the massive tank battles of North Africa that you won't want to miss. Until next time, keep your powder dry.